about. There we go. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. It is going to be a fun night in Genesis chapter 16. We're looking at Abram. We're looking at Sarai. We're looking at Hagar. And man, what a mess do we find ourselves in tonight. So this is the Jude 23 Community Podcast. It's clarity for those who are curious or confused about all things Christian. I'm Jeremiah Wood along with Nick Hardcastle. And today is like episode 21, maybe? Something like that.
Yeah.
It's
I think
good.
we're finally progressing along. 21's a pretty good number.
Yeah, not bad at all. Probably before we get started, I just want to give you a little heads up. We are talking about some pretty tender topics today. And so if you have any history of any kind of assault or anything like that, what do we call those? Do we call those trigger warnings? We just want to make sure that if you're listening to this, that you kind of know the direction we're heading, and we don't want to unintentionally or what's the other word where we're not intentionally doing something harmful.
Yeah,
Or unintentionally causing harm.
We're not coming with ill intentions towards this. That's for sure.
And I think Nick's computer probably crashed again. He's having a little bit of computer problems tonight, but we will have him back on here relatively quickly. So, there he is. That was quick. Go ahead, Nick. What were you saying?
Oh, I'm sorry. I am saying that I'm having some amazing technical difficulties this evening. But what I was trying to say is we know those situations exist. We're not coming at this with ill intentions. And we recognize every situation is real. But I think that's also why we find ourselves diving into this in the Word of God. Because the Bible is based off reality that we all have related to on a daily basis. So, yeah.
I am. Here we are. We are live. Make sure that is. Okay.
Sweet.
Perfect. Let's dive in. I'm going to start reading out of Genesis chapter 16. Nick, I'm just going to do the first 6 verses to start out with. How does that sound?
That sounds great.
Good. Let's get started. Genesis chapter 16, verse 1, it says, Abram's wife Sarai had not yet borne him a child. So she owned an Egyptian slave named Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, since the Lord has prevented me from bearing children, go to my slave. Perhaps I can have children by her. And Abraham agreed to what Sarai had said. So Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar, her Egyptian slave, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife for him. This happened after Abram had lived in the land of Canaan for 10 years. He slept with Hagar, and she became pregnant. When she realized that she was pregnant, she began to look down with contempt on her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, you are responsible for my suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and ever since that she saw that she was pregnant, she looks down on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. Abram replied to Sarai, here, your slave is in your hands. Do whatever you want with her. So then Sarai began to mistreat her so badly that Hagar ran away from her. Big story. That's just the tip of the iceberg, but This is a good place to start. Nick, there's a lot of directions we can go, but the first direction I want to start with is where Abram was at, right? Like, man, we went through from Genesis 12 all the way through chapter 15. Abram was doing so well. He was doing so good. And we get to a place where, he is established. He's following the Lord. He surrendered his life to him. He is worshiping him. He is walking in I guess you would call it favor with both God and men there in Canaan. In chapter 15, he received a covenant, and God has promised Abram that he is going to do all of these things. And not only is he going to do all these things, but he's going to do his part and Abram's part both. And so we end up in chapter 16, and kind of according to Sarai, God's plan is not moving fast enough.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about in the last podcast, whenever God and Abram were making that blood path covenant. We talked about, sometimes Abram really gets it wrong,
Hmm.
and sometimes he really gets it right. Sometimes he really gets it wrong. Um, and that's why such an act of benevolence that we saw the Lord taking on that covenant for both parties in and of itself. But honestly, what we're probably really kind of seeing as a lot of this, and I think that we're probably going to speak a bit more into it, is we've kind of seen a progression through really a melody of a few verses right here. And a melody is kind of maybe an interesting way to talk about it. But whenever we kind of start talking about a melody or a mirroring, we're seeing a lot of a story that just unfolded from Genesis 12 to 16 that had a mirroring of Genesis 1 through 11.
Mm.
And really kind of what I think we're seeing right now is that progression starting back over. And we can
Okay.
talk about some context of that as we go into it, but there's some really just specific words that bring into that. But I think before we go and unpack that, whenever we were talking about where's Abram right here, uh, we've been really big on names, Jeremiah.
Hmm.
And we've talked a lot about what names throughout the story has meant. And I think it's important to go ahead and unpack what Hagar's name meant. And
Okay.
Jeremiah, you're familiar with what Hagar's name meant?
I have my Blue Letter Bible open, so maybe I can pull that up real quick. Looks
I
like named Hagar, which is pronounced Hagar, actually.
Yeah,
But Blue Letter Bible tells me it just means or just means flight or to run
flight.
away.
Yeah, and
What did you have?
I I guess I kind of cheated. I let Tim Mackey from the Bible Project unpack it for me. But if you take that in the context of this sentence, it means her name is also the immigrant, but
Oh,
also
yeah.
a flight of what she runs away is kind of
Hmm.
a what she does a little bit later on. So we've just seen Abram go into this covenant, and now he's going back into something that's really dark, and that's abuse of an immigrant that's been
Hmm.
entrusted under his care. So I
Yeah.
don't know any kind of reactions that you have whenever we start talking about the fact that, Hagar's an immigrant that he got out of Egypt, he got from ill-gotten gains, and now it seems that that story's just kind of turned back to the demise of a servant of his people.
Right. And if you, the listener, if you don't remember back in Genesis chapter 12, there was some minor inconveniences called a famine in the land. And so Abram took his wife and his tents and all of his people and all of his livestock, and he went and lived in Egypt for a little while. And we talked about going to Egypt, literally just kind of meaning like turning away from God and giving yourself completely over to the world and giving yourself completely over to the sinful nature or the sinfulness of the world. And so we saw that with Abram. And while he was in Egypt, everything was falling apart, right? Because that's the consequence of sin. Sin causes everything to decay and fall apart. The interesting part about this story in Genesis 16 is that when it comes to talking about Hagar, right away it mentions that she was a slave from Egypt. It was an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So this is a cue, right? So 16 starts out with Sarai not being able to bear children yet, even though this was God's promise.
Mhm.
And we all of a sudden see Egypt in the name or in the description. And now we can begin to get the clue that their process is, again, turning away from God, turning away from the story, turning away from the promise, and moving into a place of self-sufficiency. So, Nick, I would say back in Genesis 3, how do the same things parallel?
Yeah. Really quick to hit on that, and just because I think it's super important. We see a really unique thing that happens that almost often whenever Abram gets in trouble, he returns back to Egypt. And he was
Mm-hmm.
returning back to the Egypt that he brought with him. One of our comments, Ravonda, who
Hey,
I have
Ravonda.
have relation with, said that, have you heard that Hagar might have even been an Egyptian princess or daughter of the king of Egypt? Which I could see that if she had obtained her there, she probably got her from Pharaoh's household. So yeah.
Probably, yeah. I would imagine when Pharaoh took Sarai, and Abram's like, "Oh, it's my sister." When Pharaoh took her, there was probably some goods that were traded. And I think if you go back to Genesis 12, it talks about how there was, some animals, some maidservants, some men servants. She was probably part of that bundle.
Yeah.
But I
But
don't
to
know if
go
I had
back,
ever heard that she was either a princess or maybe even the daughter of the king of Egypt. I had heard, I think maybe from Marty Solomon, that some scholars think she may have been Ethiopian. I'm not sure
mhm.
why. I don't remember what the explanation of that was. But yeah, she was definitely discarded as property.
Yeah, sent away just as, I guess, kind of a lesser human.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, you brought up something really unique going back to Genesis 3. And I think the language of this helps us, like I was talking a second ago about mirroring of Genesis 3. And I think that if we focus on the language that we see right here, we see that Abram's wife, which is Sarah, took Hagar, which was something that Abram and Hagar desired to be, delightful to the eye and pleasing because they can get a child through her, and gave her to Abram, her husband. So we see a very similar thing that happened in Genesis chapter 3, where Eve
Hmm.
took and gave to her husband. In this same situation, Sarai took and gave to her husband something that
Yeah,
was to be desired, which was to have a child through it. So,
yeah.
Jeremiah, I mean, what kind of all similarities do you see packing back to the Garden of Eden right here
Well,
in this
when
story?
when you look back and realize that it wasn't necessary. It wasn't just that Adam and Eve disobeyed God. The temptation came when they began to believe three specific lies about God. And so the three lies that they believed about God was that one, God can't be trusted. Two, God is holding out on me. And three, even if God did give us his best, that God's best won't satisfy me. And so those are the temptations, or those were the lies that Adam and Eve were tempted with, that God can't be trusted, God is holding out on me, and God's best won't satisfy me. And when we're looking at Genesis 16, Abram, coming out of 15, had just received the covenant. And so God had given him his promise. And at this point in time, there is a lot of self doubt really kind of leaking in, I
Hmm.
think, in Abram and Sarai, but specifically Sarai, where she is starting to believe, well, God can't be trusted. I haven't had a baby yet. I'm getting old. My body is starting to lose its vitality.
Hmm.
Maybe God can't be trusted, and maybe He's holding out on us. Maybe He doesn't really want us to. Maybe it was a metaphor, or whatever. And then there's um, this concept that God won't be able to. God's best will not be able to satisfy Sarai because she wants what she wants, and she wants it now. And when we get to this place, when we're tempted by these three lies, it causes us to have to get for ourselves what God has promised to provide. And we've said that, at least I've said that, I guess, over and over on this podcast a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I think that we really see a lot of anxiety coming, um,
Hmm.
like something that's coming out of a hurt that we see coming out of Sarai, that she lets kind of escalate and turn into this lie, like you're talking about. which results in really the formation of sin. Um,
Yeah.
because I think she probably honestly also really wanted a child. I mean,
Oh
the
yeah.
first thing that we learned about this woman was that she was barren, and she
Hmm.
probably had this was probably a relatively public thing. That everyone knew her as the barren woman.
Yeah.
That she was honestly, that's just who she was, and it was kind of a title that she was given and carried around for a long time. So you know, it's not to justify anything that she did at all, but we can see how if we don't unpack and surrender those burdens or those griefs and those hurts of our past to the Lord, they can
Yeah.
really come and escalate and turn into something that's much worse. Which obviously here is the uh, abuse of Hagar.
Right. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, it says, then Eve saw that the tree was good for food and delightful to
Hmm.
look at, and that it was desirable for obtaining wisdom. Now you look at Sarai. Sarai says, um, I'm sorry, Sarai said to Abram, since the Lord has not prevented me from bearing children, let's go to my slave. Perhaps I can have a child by her. Now, here's where it starts to get tricky, right? So they are looking, and anyway, she's looking at Sarai, being like, here's a young, beautiful, vibrant woman. She is healthy. She is strong. She is of childbearing age. This would be easy to have a child through her. And so she takes her to her husband Abram and says, here's an idea. Let's do this, right? So Sarai has fallen into that trap of trying to get for herself what God has promised to provide.
Hmm.
But instead of looking at fruit, she's seeing Sarai, or she's seeing Hagar in the process. And this is where it really starts getting dark because one, she owned Sarai. Sarai was
Hmm.
property to her. That's how she viewed her. Secondly, she was going to, her idea was to force her slave to be married to a husband who probably has no desire to be married to, force her
Yeah.
to be married, force her to have children with him, and then remove her child from her to keep as her own.
Yeah. And I think there's something really quick, sorry to point out in
No, you're
that.
good.
Do we remember the last time and the only time previous to this that we saw a man have multiple wives?
The only one I can think of was either Cain or Tubal King.
Lamech, or the last
Oh,
time. I don't know, they
Lamech.
might have,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So remember he talked about how Lamech had, it specifically called out Lamech had two wives. And then
Mm,
he talked about, I struck or Cain was protected by the Lord for killing a man. I killed someone because they just struck me on the cheek. So
mm,
honestly,
yeah,
what we're seeing right here is Abram is not just turning from the Lord's perfect plan, which
yeah.
is the Eden narrative, man and wife, to just the super reality of injustice and sin in the world that was Lamech. And honestly,
Hmm.
Lamech was what we kind of call the last iceberg in the story, right before the flood narrative, right?
Right.
So he dove deep in on that narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. And then we can see that because not only is Abram reflecting Lamech, but he's also reflecting Adam because Adam was the one that was put in charge to be the guardian of the Lord's instructions. We see that Abram's been put in charge to be the guardian of the Lord's covenant with him. And in that process, Adam kind of relented his role. We see Abram relenting his role and going along with a fleshly plan that looks desirable to the eye and seems to realistically make sense. Well, of course this makes sense, but we can begin to really see kind of the downward spiral of any kind of moral clarity through this whole process.
Yeah, and it's honestly, I think, just truly the simple fact that uh, at this point in time, we've seen Abram do some stuff that's not the most becoming, but this is really kind of where we
Hmm.
see him be like, possibly even from a reader's perspective, uh, this is a pretty bad light that gets shined on Abram, and the
Right.
simple fact that's like you're kind of sitting there saying, this is the guy who the Lord chose to have this covenant with. It didn't
Hmm.
even it didn't even like I mean, we don't know how much time took place between Genesis chapter 15 and 16, but
Right.
in terms of recorded history, he didn't make it very far.
Well, let me tell you this. This is what's really interesting is, and I don't know if you had this experience in church growing up, but I had this experience a lot where whenever we would read the story of Abraham, we are reading the story of God's chosen one. You know, he's so good, he's perfect, uh, wrong. And whenever we got to the story of Hagar, Hagar was made to look like the bad guy. She was made out to be a harlot, a charlatan, the same as Jezebel, as we would read later um, in the Old Testament. And that's such a misunderstanding of what is happening here. This woman is a captive. She has been sold into slavery. She is being held against her will. She is being married off against her will. She is being impregnated and abused against her will. And I don't know how anybody with the right eyes who is reading the story could be able to look at her and say, "Oh, of course, she's a temptress. She's the one that seduced Abram, and now look at the mess that they're in."
Yeah, and honestly, if anyone were to ever really try to draw those conclusions and say, "Oh, maybe she planted this idea in Sarai," but if you go look at her reactions for the rest of this story,
Hmm.
and honestly, by the time Hagar shows up, she's really trying to get out of this situation. I mean,
Yeah.
she honestly is a victim, a huge victim of abuse in this circumstance.
So let me ask you this question: why do we do that? Let's just stick with American church. As a church, why do we read this story? We make Abram out to be the good guy. We make Sarai out to kind of be neutral in all of this, or maybe even the victim. We make Sarai out to be the victim sometimes because I've heard that in churches a lot. And then we make Hagar out to be the bad guy. Like, why do we do that?
Yeah. And just looking at the Facebook Live, just I see a couple more people pop on. If anybody's popping on, we're in Genesis chapter 16, talking about the story of Hagar. But yeah, Jeremiah, it's such a deep question. It's like, why do we choose to make the victim look like uh, look like the bad guy in this situation? I think it's honestly because we don't know how to handle God's chosen partner in this situation being less than perfect or maybe not
Hmm.
good. Like I think that we honestly don't think that uh, we don't give enough glory to God to sit there and say that He can take somebody who is imperfect and make something huge and great and good
Hmm.
come out of him. Like we
Yeah.
just read a story about, and Abram was credited by God as being righteous
Hmm.
in the previous chapter. But the thing about it is, it's that he believed God. That's what called him righteous. He didn't just walk through the blood path covenant. He let God let that righteousness and redemption shine through him. So I guess in answering your question is sometimes we sell the story short. And the only way that we can justify the fact that this story exists in our Bible is to sit there and point fingers at somebody else instead of sit there and saying, Abram was in the wrong here. What do you
Yeah.
think?
Well, I think oftentimes we do that because we like to put ourselves in the hero role. And so the more that we allow the story to be read as Abram, the faultless hero, the more we put ourselves in his place, that we ourselves become the faultless hero. And obviously, there is no, in any sense of reality, any way for any of us to be faultless, right? And more times than not, there's never a story where we're actually the hero either. And
Yeah.
so I think when we do this, it's because we don't want to feel like the bad guy, and we always need somebody to blame. And so I think that's probably why we read the story the way we do. Now, um, somebody of the more, let's just say, feminist persuasion would say it's the patriarchy. And while I don't really disagree with that at all, it's not really the conversation I think we're going for tonight.
Yeah. No, I think that's pretty fair. The other part about it too is this isn't just a specific thing that we do with Abram, you know.
Yeah.
So I think that we try to shine maybe the best light on imperfect humans that the Lord's put in the Bible continuously throughout the story to sit there and say that he can work with imperfection if you just
Mm-hmm.
trust him.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just really awful that this story took place and existed. But the simple fact is that we all have skeletons in our closet.
Right.
Somebody might be on the opposite side of this, and there's a lot to unpack. But the simple fact is that the Lord is not for the event that happened here, and it really
Right.
specifically shows later that the Lord is for Hagar. But the
Mm-hmm.
Lord doesn't just give up on Abram and Sarai after doing this right here, which
Right.
is it's kind of an act of benevolence of itself. When we were talking about how this story related a lot to Genesis chapter 3 a second ago, the act after Adam and Eve took the fruit and they sewed fig leaves together, the Lord clothed them. He provided an act of benevolence to them. The act of benevolence that he's giving to this new couple, Sarai and Abram, is that he
Mm-hmm.
didn't give up on this story with them. He doesn't sit there and say that this is going to be where the story ends because I can't work with you anymore.
Right. Right. And I think this is why it's important to be able to point out the difference between walking in the flesh and walking in the spirit. When we're walking in the spirit, we're walking in the promise of God, we're walking in the story of God, and we're able to really begin to um, follow as the Lord Himself leads. That's why we call it walking in the Spirit. It means that we are walking in step with the leadership of the Holy Spirit. But we can see that in this story, that the more that Abram turns to his flesh, and Sarai as well, I mean, she's not guiltless in this, the more that we see them turning to Egypt, turning to their flesh, walking according to their own understanding and their own desires, and really believing the lie that they have to get this for themselves. That's where we see things fall apart. That's where we see things making a mess. And so what we're trying to do is really emphasize and I think this is what Scripture is trying to do as well over the last couple chapters, is presenting the contrast of walking in the Spirit, walking in the promise, walking in the story, trust in the story, and the difference
Mm-hmm.
between that and walking in the flesh.
Yeah. And that kind of goes back to what I was trying to talk about a second ago. We're seeing a melody or really a mirroring unfold of Genesis 1 through 11 perpetually throughout this time in the story of Abraham. We
Mm-hmm.
see we see new creation and fall. And
Yeah.
we see that followed by a destruction and redemption, but then a new covenant established. So we just got off a covenant and
Right.
we see we're kind of going back downhill again. But one thing that I do think is kind of unique in this story, and I think it would be good to, unpack a little bit before we run out of time here tonight, is talking a little bit about everything post kind of verse 4, Jeremiah. So I'm just going to reread that for sake of catching our memories up. And it said, and he, being Abram, went into Hagar and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, Hagar looked with contempt on her mistress. I wonder why. She didn't want to be involved in that situation.
Right.
And Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong be done to me be on you. I gave
Mm-hmm.
my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. Isn't this
Yeah.
just like a wild story? It's that it's like I gave you the apple and you ate it, and then, you got some superhuman strength out of it, and I didn't get that myself. It's
Right.
just weird.
Yeah. And then it's just like, again, like you said, it's mirroring three all over again because Adam and Eve, they ate the fruit. Their eyes were open. They got what they wanted, but it wasn't exactly how they expected it to go. And then they started blaming one another, right? Which is a huge issue there. And once they start blaming each other, we see the same thing happening with Sarai and Abram.
Mhm.
There's a sense of self justification. Well, it's okay now because we're married, right? But Abram didn't see Hagar as his wife. He saw Hagar as his wife's maidservant. And then Abram's like, well, we're married, so we should be having sex with each other. And so they have relations with one another. And then she becomes pregnant. And when she becomes pregnant, then she becomes a problem, specifically for Abram and Sarai and their relationship. And so or Sarai gets upset and she starts pointing fingers and starts blaming Abram, like, you did this to me. This is your fault. And this is the exact same kind of mirrored situation that we saw between Adam and Eve.
Yeah, I feel like it's the dispute of a couple, like it's what we would have seen between Adam and Eve if the God hadn't walked back in the garden, so
Yeah.
that Adam can throw Eve back under the bus and say, "Well, she gave me the fruit." But the other part about
Yeah.
it too is, Abram, is kind of saying, "Well, you get," he immediately just tells her, "It's like, well, she's your servant." He doesn't even say she's my wife.
Right.
So we're seeing a lot happen right here. If Hagar is the immigrant, really in this
Mm-hmm.
situation, she's an Egyptian who came into this story, who's underneath the authority of Abram's household, who is now in a marriage relationship to him. We
Mm-hmm.
see a couple of different abuses here. Number one, it's that Sarai and Abram are not taking care of the alien that's in their house. But as well, on top of this, is Abram had just entered into a new covenant with
Mm-hmm.
with Hagar, and he regarded that for nothing, other than the fact of the material or physical, not material, but the physical things that she could give him, which is a son. He didn't care
Mm-hmm.
about her. He entered into
Yeah.
that covenant with her and discarded it and just said, she's just a piece of property for me to get to the means that I want.
Yeah. And I think this is important to note as well is it can be very tempting to read into the story things that aren't there, right?
Yeah.
So if you were in a position where you are into passing blame onto people, you could look at the story and you would say, well, here's the problem. It's when Sarai starts having independence from her husband. And it's when Sarai starts making choices for herself. Like, this isn't Adam's fault. This was our Abram's fault. This was Sarai. Just like it wasn't Adam's fault. This was Eve's fault. Eve was the one that sinned. Sarai's the one that sinned, not the men. This is why women shouldn't be in charge. That is not what this story is saying,
No.
right? This story is saying plainly that there is consequences for living in the flesh. There are consequences for believing lies about God. And there are consequences that will progressively decay as you continue to believe them.
Yeah, exactly. And as well, in the middle of this, Marty Solomon's kind of talks about this a lot. I guess is it Solomon or Solomon? It doesn't matter. Uh, but he sits there and says that the story of creation is about a God who knows when to say enough,
Enough.
and to trust in the creation and the story that's there, and that's what he asks. But the reality of this is that Abram is not at that point right now when he knows to say enough.
Mm-hmm.
He's turning to sin, and he's just following that same progression that we see throughout the story. He didn't
Yeah.
sit there and say that I don't know how this is going to be. The Lord said he's going to bless me. He's going to give me a son. Um, but it can't be through, surely it can't be through what he's already given me. And he doesn't know how to say enough and just let the story unfold in front of him.
Yeah. Yeah. Listen to verse 6, Genesis 16:6. Then Abram replied to Sarai, "Here, your slave is in your hands. Do whatever you want with her." Then Sarai mistreated her so much that she ran away from her. I think that's a good place to really, really start landing this plane. To me, it's incredible, and I think it's perfectly applicable to us today. That the more we find ourselves in the flesh, the more we find ourselves dehumanizing one another, and the more we
Mm-hmm.
dehumanize one another, the more we typically tend to mistreat one another and abuse one another in ferocious ways. We abuse one another when we think it would be to our gain and our benefit. And
Mm-hmm.
we abuse one another when we feel like it has not worked out in our favor. So we take it out on somebody as retribution or some kind of payback. And it's a terrible place to be. That's what we should be reflecting on when we read these stories. Like, why do I do that? Why do I treat people like that? Why do I treat my spouse like that? Why do I treat the people I work with like that? Why do I treat my children like that? Why do I, whenever I'm in the flesh, deteriorate to the place where I start to dehumanize others and abuse them for it?
Yeah. I think a lot of this also ties back to a lot of the sermon that we had at church this last Sunday. Aaron Wallace at Reliance talked about taming the tongue, and he really unpacked James quite a bit, the book of James. But he said it's not just about taming the tongue, because if you can tame the tongue, you get to the core of the issue, and it's what's on your heart.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what's on the heart of Abram in this story is not the plan that God has for him.
Mm-hmm.
So when that's not on his heart, when he is not letting that rule his heart in the middle of this, you see his language just unfold to sit there and say, she's your servant. Do whatever you want with her. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter. He allows for, and he participates and is the center of all of this abuse. So the big thing is, I think the question is why do we do this to others? Why do we, dehumanize them? Why do we not make them necessarily like the full value and worth that they are? The way that the Lord sees them is that we have an issue in our heart that we have to overcome.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And I don't know if I have the answer tonight. I think it is enough to be able to kind of just sit in that mess for a little while, to recognize that we are capable of getting ourselves into this mess. You think?
Yep. And the story's about to get a little bit weirder after this. So I think this is a
So much.
good spot to stop.
Yep, indeed. We came on tonight because we missed last week because we both had stuff going on. But maybe we'll jump on here again later this week or maybe next week and we'll finish out Genesis 16. But yeah, if you have any questions over anything we did that we covered tonight, feel free to message us, reach out to us. We'd love to dialogue. We'd love to, continue on with the story.
Yeah.
Nick, any final words?
No, had a great time. Glad we could do it, brother. And look forward to the next one.
Yep, indeed. It's the Jude 23 Community Podcast. It's clarity for those who are curious or confused about all things Christian. I'm Jeremiah, along with Nick Hardcastle, and this was episode 21, I think. See y'all.
Yeah.